28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany, the morning air on March 6, 1944, was so cold that Major Hans Kogler's oxygen mask had frozen against his face. Ice crystals formed on the inside of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6's canopy as he scanned the crystalline sky, leading his mixed formation of fighters toward the bomber stream his ground controllers had promised would be unescorted at this altitude, this deep into the Reich. It was supposed to be a routine interception, the kind German fighter pilots had been executing with deadly efficiency for years. The American heavy bombers would penetrate German airspace, their escort fighters would reach the limit of their fuel and turn back somewhere over Western Germany, and then the Luftwaffe would strike with impunity. The mathematics were simple, reliable, unchanging. Fighter range was determined by fuel capacity divided by consumption rate. Physics didn't lie. The Americans couldn't change the fundamental laws of aerodynamics. And then Kogler's headset crackled with words that would echo through history, words spoken in growing panic that turned his blood to ice water. Achtung, Indiana at 12 o'clock high, single-engine fighters with drop tanks. American fighters, single-engine fighters. Here, over Brandenburg, less than 50 miles from Berlin itself. It was impossible. Welcome to this World War II history documentary, where we explore one of the most pivotal moments in military history, a moment that shattered every assumption the German High Command had built their entire defensive strategy upon. Before we dive deeper into this untold story of the Second World War, if you love war documentaries and historical investigations like this, take a moment to subscribe and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Now, let's return to that frozen morning over Brandenburg, because what Major Kogler was about to witness would trigger the most profound psychological collapse in the history of aerial warfare. No Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to penetrate this far into Germany and return to England. Every calculation, every intelligence assessment, every tactical doctrine the Luftwaffe had developed since the American daylight bombing campaign began in 1942 was built on this foundation. The maximum escort range of the American P-47 Thunderbolt barely scratched German airspace, reaching perhaps as far as Aachen on the border. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could reach Hanover on a good day, but Brandenburg, Berlin itself, this shattered every defensive strategy, every carefully constructed line of retreat, every safe zone where German fighters could reform and attack without interference. As Kogler watched, the glinting silver shapes grew larger, their distinctive squared wingtips and sleek profiles becoming unmistakable. These were not the stubby Thunderbolts or twin-boomed Lightnings German pilots had learned to engage at the extreme edge of their range. These were North American P-51B Mustangs, and they moved through the sky with the easy confidence of predators who knew they had fuel to burn, altitude to spare, and all the time in the world to hunt. Behind them, 730 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were approaching Berlin, not the usual feint toward the capital before turning to secondary targets, but a direct assault on the heart of the Third Reich. And for the first time in the history of aerial warfare, single-engine fighters would escort them all the way there and all the way back. What Kogler and his formation of 7 twin-engine Me-110 night fighters pressed into day service and 41 single-engine Me-109s did not know, could not know, was that this moment would trigger not just a military defeat, but a complete psychological collapse, the destruction not just of aircraft and pilots, but of the very belief system that had sustained German air superiority since 1939. The mathematics of annihilation were being written not in the conference rooms of the Air Ministry in Berlin, but in the contrails streaking across the Brandenburg sky at Angels 28. To understand the magnitude of this shock, we must journey back several months to when the first impossible reports began reaching Luftwaffe headquarters. The shock had actually been building for weeks, though few in the Luftwaffe High Command had connected the dots or were willing to believe what their own pilots were reporting. On January 11, 1944, Major Hermann Graf, commanding Jagdgeschwader 11, one of the most prestigious fighter wings in the Luftwaffe, had encountered American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles deeper into Germany than they should have been able to fly according to every intelligence estimate, every technical analysis, every calculation the Reich Air Ministry possessed. Graf was no novice, no inexperienced pilot prone to panic or misidentification. He was a decorated Eastern Front veteran with over 200 victories to his name, a recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of only 27 men in the entire Wehrmacht to receive this honor. When Graf reported that he had engaged American single-engine fighters over Brunswick, it should have triggered alarm bells throughout the Luftwaffe command structure. Instead, his after-action report suggesting these fighters must have refueled at secret bases in Sweden was dismissed by Berlin as combat fatigue affecting judgment. The idea that single-engine fighters could fly from England to Brunswick and back was considered physically impossible by the technical experts at the Reich Air Ministry. Therefore, Graf must have been mistaken. Perhaps he had encountered twin-engine P-38s and misidentified them in the stress of combat. Perhaps friendly aircraft had been misidentified. Perhaps the unspoken suggestion went, Graf was exaggerating to explain why he had failed to intercept the bombers effectively, but the sightings multiplied with disturbing regularity. Hanover on January 29th. Magdeburg on February 3rd. Each report pushed the known envelope of American fighter range further east, and each was met with official denial that grew increasingly shrill and detached from reality. The Reich Air Ministry issued a directive on February 15, 1944, stating categorically that reports of American single-engine fighters beyond the Ruhr industrial region were misidentifications of twin-engine P-38s or friendly aircraft, and that pilots making such claims would be subject to medical evaluation. The threat was clear. Report what you actually saw and face accusations of mental instability, or report what headquarters wanted to hear and avoid career-ending consequences. For pilots already facing death in the skies daily, the choice was obvious. Official reports began to conform to what Berlin wanted to hear, even as the private diaries and letters of these same pilots told a very different story. The truth was far more disturbing than Swedish conspiracies or pilot hallucinations, and it involved a revolution in aeronautical engineering that German technical experts had declared physically impossible. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers had achieved what their German counterparts insisted violated the basic laws of aerodynamics, extending the P-51 Mustang's combat radius to over 650 miles using expendable auxiliary fuel tanks. The mathematics seemed impossible to German analysts. A single-engine fighter carrying enough fuel to fly 1,300 miles round trip while maintaining combat performance was, according to their calculations, an engineering impossibility. The fuel weight alone would make the aircraft too heavy to take off, or too sluggish to fight, or too structurally stressed to survive combat maneuvers. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, who commanded the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary in early 1944, with the confidence of a man stating obvious facts, "We had calculated precisely. The American single-engine fighters could escort their bombers 280 miles from their bases in England, no further. This gave us all of Central and Eastern Germany as a hunting ground where we could attack the bomber streams without interference. It was simple arithmetic. Fuel capacity divided by consumption rate equals range. The Americans could not change the laws of physics." But the Americans had not changed the laws of physics. They had simply applied them more creatively, more pragmatically, and with better industrial support than anyone in the German High Command had imagined possible. This is the story told again and again in this WW2 history, this Second World War narrative. Not of German technical inferiority, for German engineering was superb, but of systemic advantages in research, production, and institutional flexibility that allowed Allied powers to solve problems the Axis couldn't. The secret lay not in the aircraft itself, which was indeed an exceptional design, but in two revolutionary innovations that German intelligence had either missed entirely or dismissed as propaganda. The Packard-built Merlin engine and the British-designed paper drop tanks would combine to create a fighter that could escort bombers to Berlin and still have fuel for 30 minutes of full-throttle combat. The Packard V1650-3 engine in the P-51B was not merely a licensed copy of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, though it had begun that way. It was an improved version manufactured to tolerances that exceeded even the original British specifications. Using American mass production techniques refined in Detroit's automotive plants, techniques developed to produce millions of cars annually with interchangeable parts and consistent quality, Packard had achieved something remarkable. An engine that produced 1,490 horsepower at sea level and, crucially, maintained over 1,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. This high-altitude performance was what transformed the Mustang from a good low-altitude fighter into a dominant high-altitude escort capable of engaging German fighters on equal or better terms at the altitudes where bomber formations flew. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, a technical specialist with Jagdgeschwader 26, examined a crashed P-51B near Gütersloh in February 1944. His report, discovered in Luftwaffe archives after the war, reveals both the German amazement at American engineering and their growing realization that they were facing not just a better aircraft, but a better industrial system. The engine installation is a masterpiece of engineering efficiency, Bauer wrote in his carefully technical German. The intercooler system alone is more sophisticated than anything in our Daimler-Benz 605 engines. But most remarkable is the production quality. Every component is machined to jeweler's precision, yet they tell us the Americans build 3 of these engines every hour. If true, this is not a war of pilots, but of production lines. If true. That caveat reveals the psychological defense mechanism at work. Surely the reports must be exaggerated. Surely American production couldn't really achieve such numbers with such quality. But it was true, and it was about to get worse for Germany. The drop tanks represented an even more elegant solution to the range problem, one that reflected a fundamentally different philosophy of engineering. Constructed from pressed paper impregnated with plastic resin, these 108-gallon auxiliary tanks weighed just 35 pounds empty, lighter than the ammunition load for one of the Mustang's machine guns. British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had developed the laminated craft paper construction method, which could hold fuel for approximately 5 hours before the paper began to break down and leak. This was more than sufficient for the 2.5-hour flight to Berlin. The beauty of the design was its disposability. German engineers had experimented with auxiliary tanks, but their approach reflected fundamental philosophical differences rooted in German engineering culture and wartime resource constraints. The German tanks were metal, reusable, expensive, and heavy. They degraded performance so severely that fighters carrying them were vulnerable to attack and often couldn't engage effectively even after dropping the tanks because the pylons and mounting hardware remained, creating drag. The American paper tanks were cheap, disposable, and light. A P-51B with 2 108-gallon drop tanks could fly to Berlin, jettison the tanks in seconds when entering combat, and fight with full performance with nothing left on the aircraft to create drag or weight penalty. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts, explained the tactical revolution in a 1944 briefing that captured the transformation in American fighter doctrine. The Germans expected us to husband our fuel, to save enough for combat and return, to operate at the edge of our capabilities. But with drop tanks, we could burn fuel like millionaires. Cruise to Berlin on the external tanks, drop them, and still have our full internal fuel load for 30 minutes of combat at full throttle, plus the flight home. We weren't flying on the edge anymore. We had margin to burn, margin to pursue, margin to hunt. To understand the psychological impact of March 6, 1944, when Mustangs first escorted bombers all the way to Berlin, one must first understand the trauma of October 14, 1943, a day the American airmen would remember as Black Thursday, when the 8th Air Force had attempted to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt without long-range fighter escort. Of 291 B-17 flying fortresses that crossed into German airspace that day, 60 were shot down outright, and 138 returned with damage, a loss rate of over 20%, with casualties exceeding 600 airmen killed, wounded, or captured in a single day's operations. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated with brutal efficiency that unescorted daylight bombing deep into Germany was unsustainable. The American strategy of precision daylight bombing, which had been sold to the combined chiefs of staff as superior to British night area bombing, appeared to be a catastrophic failure. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, was forced to suspend deep penetration raids entirely. Without fighter escort, his bombers simply couldn't survive. The loss rates would destroy the 8th Air Force faster than replacement crews could arrive from the United States. General Major Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, General of Fighters, the man responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations, declared October 14th the greatest victory of the Jagdwaffe in the defensive war. In his post-war memoir, The First and the Last, which would become essential reading for any serious student of WW2 stories and military history, Galland wrote with the confidence of a man who believed he had proven his point definitively. After Schweinfurt, we believed we had proven that daylight precision bombing was a failed concept. The Americans would have to join the British in night bombing, where accuracy was impossible and damage limited to area destruction. We had won the theoretical battle. The technology of air defense had defeated the technology of strategic bombing. But Galland, brilliant tactician though he was, one of the finest fighter leaders Germany produced during the Second World War, had made a crucial miscalculation, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He assumed the Americans would accept the limitations of existing technology rather than developing new solutions. He assumed that the technological ceiling had been reached, that fighters could only escort so far and no further, that the Germans would always have a sanctuary in the heart of the Reich where they could attack bombers without fighter interference. When reports of a new American fighter with extraordinary range began reaching his desk in December 1943, Galland dismissed them. The reports seemed too good to be true, too convenient, too perfectly tailored to solve the Americans' intractable problem. Surely this was propaganda, disinformation, or at best exaggeration. When his own pilots reported single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944, he accused them of seeing things, of making excuses for failed interceptions, of allowing combat stress to affect their judgment. It was not until February 20th, 1944, the opening day of what would become known as Big Week, that Galland began to grasp the magnitude of the threat facing his fighter force. The Americans launched 1,000 bombers with 835 fighter escorts, including the first large-scale deployment of P-51 Mustangs in meaningful numbers. Over the next 5 days, in a sustained campaign of unprecedented intensity, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters destroyed, and more critically, 100 experienced pilots killed, 17% of their available veteran fighter force wiped out in less than a week. These weren't novice pilots with a handful of missions. These were experienced men with hundreds of combat hours, men who had survived the brutal attrition of the Eastern Front or the dangerous skies over the Channel, men who represented an irreplaceable resource. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, Adolf's younger brother and commanding officer of the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26, reported after Big Week with a candor that would have been dangerous had it reached certain ears in Berlin. The appearance of Mustangs changed everything. Before, we could position ourselves beyond fighter range and attack the bombers methodically, making multiple passes, selecting our targets, breaking off when we chose. Now we had to fight our way through escorts just to reach the bombers, then fight our way out. Every mission became a battle for survival from takeoff to landing. We were no longer hunters, we were being hunted. The morning of March 6, 1944, dawned clear and cold across northern Europe. What pilots called severe, clear, perfect flying weather with unlimited visibility. At RAF Leiston in England, ground crews had been working through the night, preparing the 357th Fighter Group for the most ambitious mission yet attempted, the first P-51 unit, to provide escort all the way to Berlin and back. The tension was palpable. Everyone understood they were attempting something that had never been done before, something the enemy insisted was impossible. Failure would not just mean lost aircraft and dead pilots. It would mean the validation of every German claim that the American bombing campaign was doomed. Colonel Henry Spicer, commanding the 357th Fighter Group, briefed his pilots at 0600 hours. The briefing room was crowded, thick with cigarette smoke. and the smell of coffee and nervous sweat. "Gentlemen," Spicer began, and the room fell silent. "Today we go to Big B, the entire distance. We'll be over enemy territory for 4 hours. That's 4 hours where any mechanical problem, any navigation error, any miscalculation of fuel consumption could mean death or capture. Any man who doesn't think his aircraft is in perfect condition should abort now, before we cross the channel. There will be no second chances at these distances. No one will be able to come back for you." He paused, looking at each pilot. No one aborted. The historical record shows that moment of collective courage, that shared determination to attempt the impossible. However, Colonel Spicer himself would abort shortly after takeoff with mechanical problems, a bitter irony that left Major Thomas L. Hayes to assume command of the historic mission. At 08:30, 730 heavy bombers began lifting off from bases across East Anglia, the agricultural region of eastern England that had become the most concentrated military airfield complex in the world. Behind them, 796 fighters prepared to provide relay escort in a carefully choreographed dance of fuel ranges and handoffs. P-47 Thunderbolts would handle the initial penetration over occupied Europe. P-38 Lightnings would take over for the middle phase over Western Germany. And P-51 Mustangs would provide the deepest penetration and target escort over Brandenburg and Berlin itself. The 357th Fighter Group launched 48 P-51Bs, though only 33 would successfully reach Berlin after mechanical issues and navigation challenges in heavy cloud cover. This was the reality of war in 1944. Even with the best aircraft and preparation, mechanical reliability and weather imposed their own veto. In Germany, the Reich's Luftverteidigung, the Reich's air defense radar stations, began picking up the massive formation as it assembled over the North Sea. The plotters at Döberitz, the primary fighter control center for Berlin's defense, initially assessed this as another feint, another elaborate deception. The Americans had approached Berlin before in January and February, but always turned away at the last moment to hit targets in Western Germany. Why should today be different? Oberstleutnant Hannes Trautloft, commanding the 2nd Fighter Division responsible for Berlin's defense, studied the plotting table and made a fateful decision based on months of experience reading American tactics. He would hold his fighters on the ground until the bombers committed to their target. No point in wasting precious fuel if this was another deception, another trick to draw his fighters up and exhaust them before the real attack came elsewhere. At 11:30 hours, the lead bombers crossed into German airspace near Arnhem in occupied Holland. The escorting P-47 Thunderbolts engaged German fighters rising from bases in Holland and Western Germany. Everything proceeded according to the established pattern, the pattern that had held for months, the pattern everyone understood. The Luftwaffe pilots engaged cautiously, waiting for the moment they knew must come, the moment that always came, when the American escorts reached their fuel limits and turned back, when the bombers would be vulnerable, when the killing could begin. At 12:55 hours, as the bomber stream approached Brandenburg on the final leg toward Berlin, Major Hans Kogler led his mixed formation to intercept what ground control had assured him would be unescorted bombers. His force consisted of 7 Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighters pressed into day service because the Luftwaffe was running out of day fighters, along with 41 single-engine Bf 109s. German controllers had tracked the P-47s, turning back on schedule, and assumed, as they always assumed, as all their experience told them they should assume, that the bombers were now vulnerable. Major Thomas Hayes, leading the 33 Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group that had successfully navigated through difficult weather to reach Berlin, later described the moment in his combat report with the clinical precision of a professional military officer. We broke through the cloud layer at approximately 1300 hours to observe B-24 Liberators below and to our left. Simultaneously, we spotted approximately 40 enemy aircraft positioning for attack, Me-110s and Me-109s. They had not yet observed our presence. We had altitude advantage and complete surprise. The German formation focused entirely on the bomber stream below them, their attention fixed on their targets with the single-minded intensity of predators closing for the kill, never saw the Mustangs until it was too late. Hayes dove on the enemy fighters, his voice crackling through the radio. "Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader. Bandits at 2 o'clock low, drop tanks and attack." Feldwebel Jan Müller of Jagdgeschwader 11, flying one of the escorting Bf-109s, survived the encounter and later described it in testimony that captures the visceral shock of that moment. "We were in perfect position, just beginning our attack dive on the bombers, when tracers flashed past my canopy. I looked up to see single-engine fighters with American markings diving on us from above. My first thought, my only thought that made sense, was that these must be captured aircraft, some kind of elaborate deception. But then I saw the drop tanks falling away, dozens of them tumbling through the air, and I knew. These were real American fighters, and they had range we hadn't imagined possible. We had been lied to, or our intelligence had failed catastrophically, or physics itself had betrayed us. What followed was not a battle but an execution, a one-sided slaughter that would be repeated hundreds of times in the coming months as the pattern became clear. The German fighters, caught completely by surprise, out of position, facing opponents with altitude and speed advantage, scattered in confusion. Individual survival trumped unit cohesion. Wingmen were separated, formation discipline collapsed. In 12 minutes of combat over Brandenburg, the 357th Fighter Group claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-51. Hayes himself shot down a Bf-109 at low level near Verneuchen, then led other Mustangs in strafing a German airfield, destroying aircraft on the ground, the ultimate humiliation for any air force. At his estate at Karinhall, 50 miles north of Berlin, a vast hunting lodge filled with art looted from across occupied Europe, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring was having lunch when the telephone call came through from General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland. American fighters were over Berlin, single-engine fighters. "You're mistaken, Galland," Göring said flatly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man whose worldview could not accommodate contrary information. "Check your reports again. There must be some confusion." "Herr Reichsmarschall," Galland replied, and those who knew him said later they had never heard such careful control in his voice. "I have visual confirmation from multiple sources. P-51 Mustangs are engaging our fighters over Potsdam at this moment. Our pilots are reporting—" Göring's rage was volcanic, legendary even among men accustomed to his temper. According to his aide, Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, who was present, the Reichsmarschall threw his wineglass against the wall with enough force to shatter it and screamed, "This is treason, sabotage. The pilots are lying to cover their cowardice. I will have every man who makes such claims court-martialed." But even as Göring raged, even as he threatened and blustered and denied, the evidence was undeniable. From his own estate, standing at the windows of his grand hall, he could see the contrails over Berlin, impossibly high, impossibly far east. Hear the distant thunder of aircraft engines at full power, the rattle of machine gun fire carrying across the cold March air. His aide would later testify at Nuremberg that Göring stood at that window for nearly an hour, watching the sky, saying nothing, his face cycling through emotions that von Brauchitsch struggled to describe. Rage, disbelief, fear, and finally something that looked like resignation. That evening, Göring issued his most infamous order of the air war, an order that would create more damage to Luftwaffe morale than any American fighter. Any pilot who claims to have seen American single-engine fighters over Berlin is to be arrested for cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda. The maximum range of American fighters is the Ruhr. This is a scientific fact established by our technical experts. Reports to the contrary are false and will be treated as acts of sabotage. The order created immediate chaos in fighter units already reeling from their losses and the psychological shock of the day's events. Pilots who had just survived desperate combat against P-51s, who had watched their wingmen shot down, who had barely escaped with their lives, were now being threatened with court-martial for reporting what they had seen. The disconnect between their lived reality and official doctrine created a psychological whiplash that shattered trust in the command structure. Several squadron commanders, including Major Gerhard Barkhorn, who would survive the war as one of its highest-scoring aces, simply ignored the order, and told their pilots to report twin-engine fighters in their combat reports, a fiction everyone understood but which preserved careers and lives. General Major Galland, in a heated conference at the Air Ministry on March 8th, 2 days after the Berlin raid, attempted to force reality through Göring's psychological defenses. He presented the Reichsmarschall with a piece of a P-51's drop tank, clearly stamped "Made in USA," and recovered from a field near Magdeburg, where a Mustang pilot had jettisoned it before engaging German fighters. Göring's response entered Luftwaffe legend, repeated in barracks and mess halls across Germany, becoming a dark joke that captured the surreal disconnect between leadership and reality. "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible according to our experts. Therefore, it didn't happen." It was at this point, according to Galland's memoirs published years later, when there was nothing left to protect, that he knew Germany had lost the war. Not would lose, not might lose, but had lost. The psychological battle was over. When your own leadership denied observable reality, when reporting the truth became grounds for arrest, when scientific impossibility was asserted in the face of physical evidence, the war was already lost. Everything after was just a matter of time and body count. Later, at Nuremberg, facing charges of conspiracy and crimes against peace, Göring would admit in a moment of unusual candor, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." For individual Luftwaffe pilots, the men flying the missions, facing the guns, watching their friends die, the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented not just a tactical surprise, but an existential crisis that struck at the heart of everything they had been told about the war. These were men who had been told repeatedly, through every channel of Nazi propaganda, that they were defending an impregnable fortress, that German science and engineering were superior to anything the Allies could produce. That victory was inevitable, because the racial superiority of the Germanic peoples made it so. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, commanding the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, a thoughtful pilot who kept a detailed diary throughout the war, wrote on March 7, 1944, with the raw emotion of a man whose worldview had shattered in a single day. "Yesterday changed everything. We had always known where we were safe, where we could reform our formations, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone forever. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted, even over our own capital." What does that say about everything we've been told? The psychological impact was amplified by the quality of the opposition, and this is crucial to understanding why March 6, 1944 marked such a profound turning point in this chapter of World War II history. The P-51B was not merely present over Berlin, it was dominant. Its Merlin engine gave it a top speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, significantly faster than the Bf 109 G6's 386 miles per hour at the same altitude. Its laminar flow wing, a revolutionary design that reduced drag by maintaining smooth airflow over the wing surface, provided exceptional high-altitude handling characteristics. Its 650 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower that could saw a German fighter in half. And most crucially, its pilots were fresh, not fatigued from hours of combat at the edge of their fuel reserves, not worried about whether they had enough fuel to make it home, not operating under the psychological pressure of fighting over their own destroyed cities. Unteroffizier Werner Pieker of Jagdgeschwader 301 survived an encounter with P-51s on March 9th, 3 days after the first Berlin raid, and described the experience in a letter that captures the tactical helplessness German pilots increasingly felt. They came from above and behind, always with altitude advantage because they could climb higher while we were forming up. When we turned to engage, they would zoom climb away, using their superior power-to-weight ratio. They had the engine power to go vertical whenever they chose. When we tried to dive away, they followed easily, staying on our tails through maneuvers that should have separated us. They fought like they had unlimited fuel, making multiple passes, following us down to low altitude, pursuing individual aircraft for miles. We were used to American fighters that had to watch their fuel, that would make one pass and continue home. These Mustangs played with us like cats with mice. Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, a thoughtful tactician who would later serve as Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and eventually chairman of the NATO Military Committee, a remarkable transformation from defeated enemy to alliance leader, wrote about the strategic shift forced by the Mustang's appearance. "We had to assume every bomber formation had Mustang escort, even if we couldn't see them. They could be waiting above the bombers, waiting for us to commit to our attack runs before diving on us. This meant no more large formation attacks where we could concentrate firepower on a single bomber. No more taking time to position ourselves carefully for the optimal attack angle. We had to go in immediately with whatever we had, accept higher losses among our fighters, and hope to break through to the bombers before the Mustangs found us. But hoping is not a tactic. Hoping is what you do when you've already lost." The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin coincided with and dramatically accelerated another crisis that was slowly strangling the Luftwaffe: fuel shortage. Germany had always been dependent on synthetic fuel production, converting coal to aviation gasoline through the Burgess hydrogenation process, a complex industrial operation requiring massive plants with specialized equipment. This was Germany's Achilles heel, and Allied planners had known it since before the war. But until March 1944, these synthetic fuel plants had been largely immune from attack because they were too far from England for accurate bombing with fighter escort. And without fighter escort, bombers couldn't survive long enough over the target to conduct precision bombing. The mathematics were brutally simple. Without escort, bombers faced loss rates of 15 to 20% per mission over heavily defended targets. Without precision, meaning daylight visual bombing, the massive concrete structures of the hydrogenation plants were unlikely to be seriously damaged by bombs falling randomly across the landscape. The Mustang changed this equation overnight, and this is why historians consider it not just a good fighter, but a strategically decisive weapon system that altered the course of the Second World War. On May 12, 1944, just 2 months after Mustangs first escorted to Berlin, the 8th Air Force launched its first major attack against the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. 800 bombers, escorted by 735 fighters, including 298 P-51s, delivered 1,718 tons of bombs with unprecedented accuracy. Gun camera footage showed bombs falling directly into specific buildings, not scattered across the surrounding countryside, but concentrated on the hydrogenation units themselves. Production at Luna dropped 90% overnight. The plant's director reported that it would take at least 6 months to restore even partial production, and that was assuming no further attacks. There would be many further attacks. By June 1944, German aviation fuel production had fallen from 175,000 tons per month to 35,000 tons. By September, production was down to 7,000 tons per month, barely enough to fuel 500 sorties per day across all fronts: Eastern Front, Western Front, Italy, Balkans, Homeland Defense. Training flights were cancelled entirely. New pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 50 hours total flight time, compared to the 250 hours that had been standard in 1942, and compared to the 400 to 500 hours American pilots received before arriving in England. A veteran pilot who had transferred from the Eastern Front to Reich defense, where the presumption was that he would face less intense combat than against the Soviets, described the deteriorating situation in testimony preserved in American archives. By summer 1944, we were limited to 1 training flight per week for new pilots, then 1 per month, then none at all. New pilots arrived at our units having never fired their guns in flight, never practiced formation flying at altitude, never engaged in mock combat. We would give them perhaps 2 hours of familiarization flight if fuel was available, show them how to take off and land, and then send them into combat against American pilots with hundreds of combat hours. They were lambs to the slaughter. The shortage wasn't just fuel, it was experience, confidence, situational awareness, everything that makes a fighter pilot effective. Many died on their first mission, some died on their first combat, a few lasted a week. The true measure of the Mustang's impact became horrifyingly clear on June 6, 1944, D-Day, when the largest amphibious invasion in history required absolute air superiority over the Normandy beaches. The Allies flew, through a continuation of Part 1, 14,674 sorties on D-Day. The Luftwaffe managed 319, losing 35 aircraft in the process, a loss rate of over 10%. Over the actual invasion beaches, the most critical piece of coastline in all of military history at that moment, only 2 German fighters appeared throughout the entire day. Oberstleutnant Josef Pips Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, led the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches. With his wingman Unteroffizier Heinz Wodacek, he made a single strafing run on Sword Beach before being chased away by Spitfires. Years later, in his post-war memoir, Priller wrote with bitter honesty, "2 planes. That's all we could manage against the greatest invasion in history. Not because we lacked courage or skill, but because we lacked fuel. We lacked serviceable aircraft. And above all, we lacked air superiority." The Mustangs had taken that from us months before, not over Normandy, but over Berlin. By the time the invasion came, we were already a spent force. Major Werner Milders, who had commanded Jagdgeschwader 54 and claimed a P-51 on May 24, 1944, one of the few German pilots to successfully down a Mustang in even combat and survive to tell the tale, reflected on the strategic situation with the clarity that comes from having faced death repeatedly. After the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, we never regained the initiative. Never. We were always reacting, always defending, always outnumbered. The Americans could strike anywhere at any time with fighter escort. We could barely defend our own airfields. Individual pilots might achieve local successes, shoot down a bomber or even a fighter. But strategically, the war in the air was lost the moment they could reach Berlin. Everything after was just the working out of that fundamental fact. In desperation, as the summer of 1944 progressed and losses mounted, the Luftwaffe developed increasingly suicidal tactics. The Sturmgruppe assault group concept epitomized this desperation, this willingness to sacrifice pilots in the hope of inflicting unsustainable losses on American bombers. Focke-Wulf 190 A8s were modified with additional armor plating around the cockpit, 30mm cannons replacing the standard 20mm weapons, and reinforced windscreens capable of withstanding 50 caliber machine gun fire at close range. These flying tanks, weighing hundreds of pounds more than standard fighters, would bore straight through fighter screens to attack bombers at point-blank range, accepting losses to achieve kills. Major Walter Dahl, who had taken command of Jagdgeschwader 300 on June 27, 1944, became the most famous proponent of these tactics, a true believer in the idea that German will could overcome material disadvantage. On July 7, 1944, Dahl led the 4th Sturmgruppe of Jagdgeschwader 3 with support from 2 Gruppen of Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 300 in a massive assault against B-24 liberators near Leipzig. The heavily armored Focke-Wulfs managed to destroy an entire squadron of 12 B-24s from the 492nd Bomb Group in less than a minute, a devastating success that seemed to vindicate the concept, but the cost was catastrophic. Of the Sturmgruppe fighters launched, 9 were shot down in the attack and 3 crash-landed with damage so severe they were written off. The escorting Bf-109s, tasked with keeping American fighters away from the vulnerable Sturmgruppe aircraft, fared even worse against the Mustang escorts. The tactics that had worked briefly in July, achieving surprise and inflicting real damage, became increasingly suicidal as American fighter strength grew, and American pilots learned to identify and prioritize the heavily armed Focke-Wulfs. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, the same technical specialist who had examined crashed Mustangs earlier, was one of the few Sturmgruppe pilots to survive multiple missions. His testimony captures the reality behind the propaganda. "We were flying coffins. The armor that was supposed to protect us made us so slow that the Mustangs could make multiple firing passes at leisure. We couldn't evade, couldn't maneuver effectively, couldn't even run away. The order was to ram bombers if our guns jammed, to physically crash into them. But how could we ram when we couldn't even reach the bombers through the fighter screen? Each mission was Russian roulette with all chambers loaded. We knew we were dead men. We flew anyway because we were soldiers, because our orders demanded it, because we didn't know what else to do. Germany's last hope, repeated endlessly in propaganda broadcasts as 1944 turned to 1945, lay in revolutionary technology. The Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, Swallow, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, it was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. In the hands of experienced pilots, operating under optimal conditions, it could have changed the air war, or at least prolonged it. But the Me-262 arrived too late, in too few numbers, and critically, Hitler's insistence that it be used as a blitz bomber, a fast bomber, rather than a fighter interceptor, wasted precious months when production could have focused on the air defense mission. By the time significant numbers were available for fighter operations in late 1944, the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel to train pilots in their operation, lacked the materials to maintain them properly, and lacked the secure airfields to operate them safely from. Adolf Galland, who had been dismissed as General der Jagdflieger in January 1945 for his increasingly vocal criticism of Göring's and Hitler's policies, was given command of Jagdverband 44, an elite jet unit formed in February 1945 as a last desperate gesture. Even with Germany's best surviving pilots flying the world's most advanced fighter, they could not overcome the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied forces. Galland himself, in testimony given to American interrogators after the war, described the futility with painful honesty. We would take off, shoot down one or two bombers or fighters, and land to find our airfield under attack by Mustangs strafing the runway. They hunted us on the ground, loitering over our bases, catching Me-262s during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases when the jets couldn't use their speed advantage. For every minute we were in the air, Mustangs were overhead for an hour. We had the superior weapon, but they had the superior system. Technology without numbers, fuel, infrastructure, and secure bases is useless. We had built a sword we couldn't wield. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was experiencing what military historians would later term the death of the expert, the systematic elimination of the veteran pilots who formed the backbone of any effective air force. The men who had scored dozens or hundreds of victories, who had survived years of combat, through a combination of skill, luck, and hard-won experience, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The appearance of Mustangs deep inside Germany meant there was no safe space left to train replacements. No quiet sector where novices could gain experience against less capable opponents. No rear area where wounded pilots could recuperate and gradually work their way back to combat readiness. The statistics tell a grim story that numbers alone cannot fully convey. In 1940, new Luftwaffe pilots received 250 hours of flight training before entering combat, including extensive gunnery practice, aerobatics, formation flying, and simulated combat. By 1944, this had been reduced to 80 hours, with much of that in obsolete training aircraft. By early 1945, some pilots were sent into combat with as little as 20 hours in type, meaning 20 hours flying the actual aircraft they would take into combat. Meanwhile, American pilots arriving in England typically had 400 to 500 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in type and extensive gunnery training. The disparity in training translated directly into survival rates and combat effectiveness. Johannes Steinhoff, who would survive terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, his face essentially melted by burning jet fuel, requiring dozens of reconstructive surgeries over years, later reflected on the moral agony of commanding during this period. We were sending children to their deaths. Boys who could barely fly formation were expected to engage Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. It wasn't combat, it was murder, and we were complicit in it. I stopped looking at the replacement pilots' faces after a while. I knew most would be dead within a week. Learning their names, their stories, where they came from, what they hoped for after the war, it made it unbearable. So I stopped. I made myself into a machine that processed men into missions and casualties into reports. It was the only way to keep functioning. The loss rates confirm this assessment with horrifying clarity. In January 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was 7 missions. Not 7 months, not 7 weeks. 7 missions. Some units experienced 100% turnover in personnel in a single month. Jagdgeschwader 301, once an elite unit with a proud combat history, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945, while claiming only 41 victories, a negative exchange ratio that meant the unit was destroying itself faster than it was destroying the enemy. Lieutenant Günther Schmidt, who survived the war with 3 victories after being assigned to a fighter unit in March 1945 with minimal training, provided a newly qualified pilot's perspective that captures the terror of being thrown into combat unprepared. My first mission was supposed to be a training flight, a simple patrol over Brunswick with experienced pilots who would show me the procedures. We were bounced by Mustangs before we even formed up properly. My flight leader was killed in the first pass. I never saw the Mustang that shot at me, only tracers passing my canopy. So close I could feel the heat. I dove to treetop level and flew home alone, following the Autobahn because I was too disoriented to navigate properly. That was my combat training. 15 minutes of terror and then flying alone trying not to crash. They sent me up again the next day. While the Luftwaffe bled to death in the skies, American bombing was relentlessly destroying German aircraft production with a methodical efficiency that demonstrated the power of sustained strategic bombing when conducted with proper fighter escort. The Mustang's long range meant no factory was safe, no production center beyond reach. The great aircraft manufacturing centers at Regensburg, Augsburg, Wiener Neustadt, and Leipzig were hit repeatedly with devastating accuracy. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, who would later testify at Nuremberg about the German war economy, provided crucial insight into the strategic impact. The Mustang allowed the Americans to maintain continuous pressure on our aircraft industry. We would repair a factory, resume production, and within days or weeks, it would be destroyed again. We began dispersing production to underground facilities, caves, and forests, but this increased costs dramatically and reduced efficiency by 75%. We were producing more fighters in absolute numbers in 1944 than in 1943, but we couldn't produce them fast enough to replace losses, and we had neither the fuel to fly them nor the pilots to fly them effectively. We were trapped in an impossible situation. The numbers bear this out with stark clarity. German fighter production peaked at 3,300 aircraft in September 1944, an impressive achievement for an economy under sustained attack. But losses that same month were 3,217 aircraft destroyed. The Luftwaffe was literally losing aircraft faster than the world's most efficient remaining industrial economy could build them. Moreover, the quality of hastily assembled aircraft from dispersed facilities was declining precipitously. Engine failures, structural weaknesses, and system malfunctions plagued new aircraft. Pilots reported guns that jammed, controls that froze, engines that failed without warning. Oberingenieur Kurt Tank, designer of the legendary Focke-Wulf 190, visited frontline units in December 1944 and was shocked by what he found, as recorded in his post-war testimony to British interrogators. Aircraft were being delivered with critical defects that should never have passed quality control. Engines that should run for 100 hours were failing after 10. Control surfaces were jamming in flight. Guns were misaligned, firing off-bore. We had gone from producing the world's finest fighters to pushing out flying death traps. The workers were exhausted. Many were slave laborers who actively sabotaged production. The materials were substandard, and the testing was non-existent because we didn't have the fuel for proper test flights. We were sabotaging ourselves, killing our own pilots through industrial collapse. On January 1st, 1945, in what would prove to be the Luftwaffe's final major offensive operation, the German Air Force launched Operation Bodenplatte, Base Plate, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. 900 fighters, virtually the entire remaining strength of the Luftwaffe in the West, took off at dawn in complete radio silence. Many pilots were flying their first combat mission. Most had never flown in formations larger than 4 aircraft. The mission was so secret, so desperately guarded against Allied intelligence, that German flak units weren't warned, resulting in devastating friendly fire incidents as German anti-aircraft guns shot down German fighters. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. 305 Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and 190 damaged, impressive numbers that initially seemed to justify the operation. But the cost was catastrophic and unsustainable. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and, more critically, 213 pilots killed or captured, including many irreplaceable experienced leaders. 3 Geschwader Kommodore, wing commanders, 6 Gruppenkommandeure, group commanders, and 14 Staffelkapitäne, squadron leaders, were killed or captured in a single day. The Luftwaffe had decapitated itself. Oberst Hans-Joachim Kogler, who survived the mission, called it the Luftwaffe's death ride in his post-war memoir. "We destroyed aircraft that the Americans replaced within a week. We lost pilots we could never replace. Worse, we burned our last reserves of fuel. After Bodenplatte, we were a spent force. We could no longer even pretend to contest the skies over Germany." The American response was swift and absolutely brutal. Within 48 hours, Mustang sweeps were methodically hunting down the weakened German fighter units across occupied Europe and Germany itself. Airfields were strafed repeatedly, sometimes multiple times per day. Aircraft hidden in forests were spotted from the air and destroyed. In the week following Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe lost another 400 aircraft, mostly destroyed on the ground, unable to take off, unable to fight back. Major John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group, who claimed 24 aerial victories during the war and would later rise to the rank of general, described the post-Bodenplatte period with a mix of professional satisfaction and human discomfort. "It was almost sad by that point. We'd find German airfields packed with aircraft that couldn't fly for lack of fuel. We'd strafe them, they'd burn, and there would be no opposition, no flak, no fighters rising to intercept. It wasn't combat anymore. It was execution, necessary but not satisfying. These were brave men trapped in an impossible situation." As 1945 progressed and the Reich contracted under pressure from east and west, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective military force. Individual pilots still flew individual sorties, acts of desperate courage or fatalism, but coordinated operations were impossible. The appearance of Mustangs over any German airfield meant likely destruction. Take off and you might be bounced during climb-out. Land and you might be strafed on the runway. Even sitting on the ground was dangerous, as American fighters methodically destroyed every aircraft they could find. Pilots began refusing to fly, not from cowardice, but from the logical recognition that taking off meant certain death with no possibility of affecting the war's outcome. Courts-martial for cowardice became common, though executing experienced pilots when so few remained was counterproductive and was often commuted to frontline service, which was itself essentially a death sentence. The psychological toll was devastating, and this human cost is often overlooked in military histories focused on statistics and strategic outcomes. Heinz Knoke, who had once written enthusiastically in his diary about defending the Reich, about the honor of service, about faith in victory, made his final published diary entry on March 15, 1945, just over a year after that first shocking encounter over Berlin. "I have lost countless friends in this unit. Boys I trained, boys I flew with, boys I loved like brothers. All dead, and for what? We cannot even reach the bombers anymore. The Mustangs are everywhere, over our airfields, over our cities, over our capital. They own our sky. I am no longer a fighter pilot. I am a target waiting to be killed. I don't know if I will survive another week. I don't know if I want to." The Luftwaffe's own records, captured after the war and meticulously analyzed by Allied historians, tell the story in numbers that represent human lives. January 1944, 2,395 fighter pilots available for operations in the defense of the Reich. June 1944, D-Day, 1,523 fighter pilots available. January 1945, 742 fighter pilots available for operations. April 1945, approximately 200 fighter pilots still flying. Of the Luftwaffe pilots who were operational on January 1, 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war uninjured. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin had triggered a complete annihilation that consumed an entire generation of German aviators over the course of just 16 months. After the war ended in May 1945, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were remarkably candid about the impact of the P-51 Mustang, perhaps because they had nothing left to protect, no regime to serve, no illusions to maintain. Their testimony, collected by Allied intelligence officers and later by historians researching this chapter of WW2 history, provides unique insight into the psychological collapse of a once dominant force. These were not men making excuses. Many were highly decorated, highly skilled professionals who had faced the best the Soviets and British could offer and prevailed. Their assessment of the Mustang was professional, detailed, and devastating. Adolf Galland, despite his wartime dismissal and conflicts with Nazi leadership, remained one of the most respected voices on the Luftwaffe's defeat, both for his tactical brilliance and his willingness to speak uncomfortable truths. In a 1954 interview conducted for a military history documentary, he stated with the precision of an engineer analyzing a failed system, the P-51 Mustang was the decisive weapon in the air war over Germany, not the best fighter in every category individually. The Spitfire turned better at lower altitudes, the Focke-Wulf 190 rolled better, the Me-262 was faster in level flight, but the Mustang was very good at everything and could fly anywhere. Range, speed, handling, firepower, reliability. It had no critical weaknesses. Once it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game, where your opponent suddenly has queens that can move anywhere on the board while your pieces are restricted to small squares. The strategic implications were immediately clear to anyone willing to see them. Johannes Steinhoff, who survived those terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, who underwent dozens of painful reconstructive surgeries, who later served as Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and eventually chairman of the NATO Military Committee, provided an assessment that was equally stark and perhaps more strategic. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe tactically, it destroyed the very concept of German air superiority that had underpinned our entire defensive strategy. We had built everything on the assumption that Germany proper, the industrial heartland, was beyond the range of single-engine fighters. When that assumption proved false, everything collapsed. It wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe from which we never recovered and from which we couldn't recover because the fundamental premise of our defense was wrong. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from Heinz Knoke, whose diary had chronicled the entire arc from confidence through shock to collapse. In 1975, at a reunion of former adversaries held in Colorado, where German and American pilots who had tried to kill each other 3 decades earlier now met as allies and even friends, Knoke met Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a triple ace who had flown Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group, the very unit that first escorted to Berlin. Knoke told him, and Anderson recorded the conversation in his own memoir. "You must understand, when we saw your Mustangs over Berlin that first time, it was like discovering the ocean had no shore, that we had been fighting at the edge of an abyss we didn't know existed. We had been told we were winning, that America was too far away to hurt us, that our industrial heartland was safe. Then suddenly you were there over our capital with fuel to spare, making combat maneuvers, hunting us. It broke something in us, not just our will to fight, but our faith in everything we had been told. If they lied about this, what else were they lying about? The Mustangs over Berlin didn't just destroy our Air Force. They destroyed our belief in the regime." Erich Hartmann, the war's highest-scoring ace with 352 victories, almost all achieved on the Eastern Front against Soviet aircraft, survived by developing specific anti-Mustang tactics when he occasionally faced them. He would attack only when holding every possible advantage, altitude, sun position, numerical superiority, and would immediately disengage if Mustangs appeared, trading pride for survival. In his post-war interviews conducted for various military history studies, he acknowledged with professional respect, "Fighting Mustangs was not combat as we understood it. It was survival, playing defense, even when we were supposedly attacking the bombers. They had every advantage: numbers, altitude, fuel endurance, and increasingly pilot quality, as our experienced men died and theirs gained experience. We could only hope to survive each encounter and perhaps surprise an isolated straggler. It was not a war we could win, only one we could survive if we were lucky and smart and didn't take unnecessary risks." The statistical impact of the P-51 Mustang on the air war over Europe can be measured in numbers that reveal both the scale of American success and the completeness of German defeat. Aircraft destroyed, P-51 Mustangs claimed 4,950 aerial victories in the European theater. This number represents only confirmed kills with corroborating evidence. The actual number was likely higher. Heinz Knoke, who had once written enthusiastically in his diary about defending the Reich, about the honor of service, about faith in victory, made his final published diary entry on March 15, 1945, just over a year after that first shocking encounter over Berlin. "I have lost countless friends in this unit. Boys I trained, boys I flew with, boys I loved like brothers. All dead, and for what? We cannot even reach the bombers anymore. The Mustangs are everywhere, over our airfields, over our cities, over our capital. They own our sky. I am no longer a fighter pilot. I am a target waiting to be killed. I don't know if I will survive another week. I don't know if I want to." The Luftwaffe's own records, captured after the war and meticulously analyzed by Allied historians, tell the story in numbers that represent human lives. January 1944, 2,395 fighter pilots available for operations in the defense of the Reich. June 1944, D-Day, 1,523 fighter pilots available. January 1945, 742 fighter pilots available for operations. April 1945, approximately 200 fighter pilots still flying. Of the Luftwaffe pilots who were operational on January 1, 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war uninjured. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin had triggered a complete annihilation that consumed an entire generation of German aviators over the course of just 16 months. After the war ended in May 1945, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were remarkably candid about the impact of the P-51 Mustang, perhaps because they had nothing left to protect, no regime to serve, no illusions to maintain. Their testimony, collected by Allied intelligence officers and later by historians researching this chapter of WW2 history, provides unique insight into the psychological collapse of a once dominant force. These were not men making excuses. Many were highly decorated, highly skilled professionals who had faced the best the Soviets and British could offer and prevailed. Their assessment of the Mustang was professional, detailed, and devastating. Adolf Galland, despite his wartime dismissal and conflicts with Nazi leadership, remained one of the most respected voices on the Luftwaffe's defeat, both for his tactical brilliance and his willingness to speak uncomfortable truths. In a 1954 interview conducted for a military history documentary, he stated with the precision of an engineer analyzing a failed system, the P-51 Mustang was the decisive weapon in the air war over Germany. Not the best fighter in every category individually. The Spitfire turned better at lower altitudes. The Focke-Wulf 190 rolled better. The Me-262 was faster in level flight, but the Mustang was very good at everything and could fly anywhere. Range, speed, handling, firepower, reliability. It had no critical weaknesses. Once it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game, where your opponent suddenly has queens that can move anywhere on the board, while your pieces are restricted to small squares. The strategic implications were immediately clear to anyone willing to see them. Johannes Steinhoff, who survived those terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, who underwent dozens of painful reconstructive surgeries, who later served as Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and eventually chairman of the NATO Military Committee, provided an assessment that was equally stark and perhaps more strategic. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe tactically, it destroyed the very concept of German air superiority that had underpinned our entire defensive strategy. We had built everything on the assumption that Germany proper, the industrial heartland, was beyond the range of single-engine fighters. When that assumption proved false, everything collapsed. It wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe from which we never recovered and from which we couldn't recover because the fundamental premise of our defense was wrong. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from Heinz Knoke, whose diary had chronicled the entire arc from confidence through shock to collapse. In 1975, at a reunion of former adversaries held in Colorado, where German and American pilots who had tried to kill each other 3 decades earlier now met as allies and even friends, Knoke met Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a triple ace who had flown Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group, the very unit that first escorted to Berlin. Knoke told him, and Anderson recorded the conversation in his own memoir. "You must understand, when we saw your Mustangs over Berlin that first time, it was like discovering the ocean had no shore, that we had been fighting at the edge of an abyss we didn't know existed. We had been told we were winning, that America was too far away to hurt us, that our industrial heartland was safe. Then suddenly you were there over our capital with fuel to spare, making combat maneuvers, hunting us. It broke something in us, not just our will to fight, but our faith in everything we had been told. If they lied about this, what else were they lying about? The Mustangs over Berlin didn't just destroy our Air Force. They destroyed our belief in the regime. Erich Hartmann, the war's highest-scoring ace with 352 victories, almost all achieved on the Eastern Front against Soviet aircraft, survived by developing specific anti-Mustang tactics when he occasionally faced them. He would attack only when holding every possible advantage: altitude, sun position, numerical superiority, and would immediately disengage if Mustangs appeared, trading pride for survival. In his post-war interviews conducted for various military history studies, he acknowledged with professional respect, "Fighting Mustangs was not combat as we understood it. It was survival, playing defense, even when we were supposedly attacking the bombers. They had every advantage: numbers, altitude, fuel endurance, and increasingly pilot quality, as our experienced men died and theirs gained experience. We could only hope to survive each encounter and perhaps surprise an isolated straggler. It was not a war we could win, only one we could survive if we were lucky and smart and didn't take unnecessary risks." The statistical impact of the P-51 Mustang on the air war over Europe can be measured in numbers that reveal both the scale of American success and the completeness of German defeat. Aircraft destroyed, P-51 Mustangs claimed 4,950 aerial victories in the European theater. This number represents only confirmed kills with corroborating evidence. The actual number was likely higher. It represented the marriage of British innovation. The Merlin engine, developed by Rolls-Royce, American mass production capability, built by North American Aviation using automobile industry techniques, and continuous improvement based on systematic analysis of combat experience. It was not the product of a single genius designer like Willy Messerschmitt or Kurt Tank, though the North American design team was certainly talented. It was the product of collaborative refinement, of institutional learning, of systematic problem-solving applied across an entire industrial system. The P-51D, which began arriving in Europe in May 1944, just 2 months after the first Berlin raid, incorporated numerous improvements based on combat experience systematically gathered from frontline units. The bubble canopy provided 360-degree visibility, eliminating the blind spots that had gotten pilots killed. 650 caliber machine guns with improved ammunition feed systems reduced jamming. The K-14 computing gun sight, an early analog computer, improved hit probability. Strengthened wings allowed additional ordnance for ground attack missions. Improved radio equipment enhanced coordination. The Packard V1650-7 engine, producing 1,590 horsepower, provided even better performance. Each improvement addressed specific combat needs identified by pilots through systematic debriefing and after-action reporting. This feedback loop Combat experience driving rapid design improvement, driving better combat performance, was something the German system with its chaotic leadership, competing power centers and disrupted production could not match. Dr. Kurt Tank, designer of the superb Focke-Wulf 190 series, admitted after the war in testimony to British interrogators with the honesty of a man who no longer had anything to lose. "We could design aircraft equal to or better than the Mustang. The Ta-152H was superior in many ways, particularly at high altitude. But we could not produce them in the quantities needed, could not fuel them consistently, could not train pilots to fly them effectively, and could not protect the factories building them from bombing. The Americans didn't just build a better fighter, though they did. They built a better system for designing, producing, and employing fighters, a system that could learn and adapt faster than ours. That systemic advantage was decisive." The German response to the Mustang threat revealed the fundamental flaws in the Nazi system that would ultimately doom it. Instead of acknowledging the threat rationally and adapting strategy and tactics, they denied reality and threatened anyone who reported uncomfortable truths. Instead of concentrating resources on fighter production for homeland defense, Hitler demanded continued bomber production for revenge attacks. Instead of preserving their experienced pilots as instructors to train the next generation, they flew them in combat until they died, squandering irreplaceable human capital. Instead of admitting strategic miscalculation and seeking negotiated peace while they still had leverage, they court-martialed pilots who reported what they had seen in the sky. This pattern of denial and doubling down on failed strategies was not unique to the air war, but characterized Nazi leadership across all theaters. The impact on Germany's celebrated aces, the men who had been lionized in propaganda as proof of Aryan superiority, was particularly telling and tragic. These were men who had scored dozens, sometimes hundreds of victories, who were not just pilots but symbols of German martial prowess, whose photographs appeared in newspapers and whose exploits were broadcast on radio. The Mustang era saw their systematic elimination one by one, and each death was not just a tactical loss, but a propaganda defeat. Major Klaus Mitusch, 72 victories, was killed by P-51s on September 17, 1944, bounced while forming up for an attack on bombers. He had survived 452 combat missions, had been shot down multiple times and always returned, had seemed almost invincible. 4 Mustangs dove on his formation from the sun, and he never saw them until tracers cut his aircraft in half. Oberstleutnant Walter Oesow, 123 victories, was shot down by P-38 Lightnings on May 11, 1944, demonstrating that even older American fighters were becoming lethal as German pilot quality declined and American pilot experience increased. Major Hans Philipp, 206 victories, was shot down by P-47 Thunderbolts on October 8, 1943, even before the Mustangs arrived in force, presaging what was coming. His death was a shock to the Luftwaffe. If Philipp could be killed, anyone could be killed. The list continues, a roll call of Germany's finest pilots eliminated one by one. Gordon Golub, Günther Rall, Hermann Graf, all wounded and forced out of combat. Walter Nowotny, 258 victories, killed in combat with P-51s while flying an Me-262 jet on November 8, 1944. The jet's speed advantage couldn't save him during the vulnerable landing phase. By war's end, of the 107 German pilots who had achieved 100 or more victories, 95 were dead, seriously wounded, or captured. The Mustang hadn't just defeated the Luftwaffe, it had annihilated its institutional memory, its accumulated experience, its veteran cadre that could never be replaced. As 1945 began, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in reality, more in organizational charts filed in Berlin than in actual combat capability. Aircraft that still appeared in strength reports were hidden in forests, dispersed to fake farm buildings, camouflaged under trees or scattered to autobahn strips converted to emergency runways. Pilots lived like hunted animals, moving constantly to avoid the omnipresent Mustangs and other Allied fighters that now roamed German skies hunting for targets of opportunity. Oberstleutnant Gordon Golub, one of the few senior commanders still alive and still in command, who had survived years of combat to reach this desperate endgame, issued orders in late January 1945 that revealed the complete desperation of the situation. Aircraft will take off only when enemy bombers are directly overhead of the airfield. Maximum sortie duration, 15 minutes. Any pilot airborne longer than 20 minutes without combat confirmation will be presumed to have defected to the enemy. The fear of Mustangs had become so pervasive that many pilots would abort missions at the first report of escort fighters. They weren't cowards. They were rational men making rational calculations about survival. Courts-martial for cowardice became common, though executing experienced pilots, when so few remained, was obviously counterproductive, and sentences were often commuted to frontline service, which was itself essentially a death sentence, just slower and more painful. Morale collapsed entirely when pilots realized that even successful missions achieved nothing meaningful. You could shoot down a bomber and the Americans would replace it within days. The bombers kept coming in formations of hundreds, the Mustangs kept escorting them, and Germany kept dying under the weight of high explosive and incendiary bombs. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, 99 victories, one short of becoming a century ace, one victory away from joining that exclusive club that had seemed so important just months earlier, was shot down and killed on December 23, 1944. His wingman, who barely escaped the same attack, reported the engagement in his after-action report with the shell-shocked brevity of trauma. 6 Mustangs came from above and behind. Heinrich never had a chance to evade. They followed him down through his dive, firing continuously. Even after his aircraft was burning, trailing smoke and pieces, they kept shooting. They wanted to make sure. This ruthlessness was new, or at least newly prevalent. Earlier in the war, there had been a degree of chivalry between pilots, an unspoken code. Pilots who bailed out were generally not attacked in their parachutes. Damaged aircraft trying to withdraw were sometimes allowed to escape. But by 1945, American pilots had seen too many friends die in burning bombers, knew the war's end was approaching, and wanted to ensure the Luftwaffe could never recover, could never threaten another generation of American airmen. Every German pilot killed was one who couldn't fly the jets or advanced fighters Germany was still desperately trying to develop and field in meaningful numbers. Every experienced pilot eliminated was one less instructor for the next generation. The killing had become systematic, methodical, almost industrial in its efficiency. American Mustang pilots were remarkably consistent in their assessment of the campaign's progression from the first Berlin raid in March 1944 through the final collapse in April and May 1945. Colonel John C. Meyer, who scored 24 aerial victories and would later command major units in Korea and rise to 4-star rank, provided this analysis in a 1952 interview. From March to June 1944, we fought the Luftwaffe's first team. Experienced, aggressive, skilled pilots who made us work for every kill. From June to December 1944, we faced their second line, still dangerous but less coordinated, making more mistakes, showing less tactical sophistication. By 1945, we were shooting down students, kids who could barely fly formation, let alone fight effectively. It wasn't satisfying in any sporting sense. It was necessary but tragic. You felt like you were shooting fish in a barrel, but those fish were still trying to kill your bomber crews, so you did what had to be done. Lieutenant Colonel John B. England, commanding the 362nd Fighter Squadron, observed the psychological transformation of German fighter pilots over the course of the campaign. The Mustang didn't just give us range and performance, it gave us psychological dominance. German pilots knew that if they saw Mustangs, especially multiple Mustangs working together, they were probably going to die. You could see it in their tactics. Early in 1944, they'd attack aggressively, even when outnumbered, using skill and experience to offset our numerical advantages. By late 1944, they'd run at the first sight of us, breaking off attacks on bombers to save themselves. By early 1945, many wouldn't even take off if Mustangs were reported in the area. We had broken them psychologically before we broke them physically. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier and become perhaps the most famous test pilot in American history, scored 11.5 victories flying Mustangs. His assessment was characteristically direct, cutting through euphemism to tactical reality. The P-51 was an honest airplane. It told you what it was going to do, didn't have hidden vices, responded predictably to control inputs. Against German fighters in 1944 and 1945, flying a Mustang was like having a rifle when they had muskets. We had every advantage: speed, range, altitude performance, numbers, and by 1945, better training. It wasn't a fair fight, but war isn't supposed to be fair. War is supposed to be won as quickly and decisively as possible. Perhaps the most telling testimony about the Mustang's impact came not from fighter pilots, but from bomber crews whose lives depended on fighter Escort, who understood better than anyone what those silver P-51s meant for their survival. Technical Sergeant William McManus, a B-17 tail gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, the unit that suffered such horrific losses, it was nicknamed the Bloody 100th, recalled the transformation in mission survivability. Before the Mustangs arrived in force, every mission deep into Germany felt like suicide. We'd watch our escort fighters turn back somewhere over Western Germany, and we'd know the wolves were coming. You'd see German fighters forming up beyond flak range, getting ready to attack, and you'd just grip your guns tighter and pray. Maybe 1 in 10 of us wouldn't make it back. After March 1944, once we had Mustangs with us all the way to target and back, it was like having guardian angels. Our loss rate went from probably going to die to probably going to make it home. Those little friends with the big range saved thousands of us. Every bomber crew member who survived the war owes a debt to the Mustang pilots who escorted us. The P-51's success was not just a triumph of aeronautical design, though the aircraft was indeed brilliantly designed. It was a triumph of industrial production that demonstrated American manufacturing supremacy in a way no propaganda could match. North American Aviation's plants in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas achieved production rates that seemed impossible by German standards, rates that German industrial planners dismissed as American exaggeration until captured documents after the war proved they were real. At peak production in 1944, North American Aviation was completing 1 P-51 Mustang every 63 minutes around the clock. The assembly line, adapted from automobile manufacturing techniques pioneered by Henry Ford and refined by the entire American automotive industry, broke aircraft construction into specialized stations where workers became experts at single tasks, achieving speeds and precision impossible with traditional aircraft manufacturing methods. Paul Peters, a production supervisor at the Inglewood plant, described the system in a 1985 oral history interview. We had housewives who had never worked outside the home installing control cables with jeweler's precision. We had teenagers barely out of high school riveting wing panels. We had men too old for the draft assembling engines. None of them had built an airplane before Pearl Harbor, but the system was so well designed, the processes so clearly documented and broken down into manageable steps, that within weeks they were producing perfect work. We had quality control inspectors at every station. If something wasn't right, if a rivet wasn't flush or a bolt wasn't torqued to specification, the line stopped until it was fixed. We didn't compromise on quality, even as we pushed for speed. The contrast with German production by 1944 and 1945 was stark and tragic. As Allied bombing forced dispersal of aircraft manufacturing, German planes were being assembled in caves, forests, and abandoned mines by slave laborers and exhausted German workers. Different components might be manufactured hundreds of miles apart and transported through a rail system under constant attack. Quality control became impossible when inspectors couldn't easily travel between facilities. Workers, many of them concentration camp prisoners or forced laborers from occupied territories, had every incentive to sabotage production and did so whenever possible. Oberstleutnant Dietrich Hrabak, who commanded various fighter units throughout the war and survived to become a founding member of the post-war Luftwaffe, observed the production collapse with despair. We would receive new aircraft that looked perfect on the exterior, but were flying coffins internally. Control cables installed incorrectly so they might snap under stress. Fuel lines that leaked, creating fire hazards. guns that wouldn't fire or jammed after a few rounds, engines that failed without warning. The Americans were building better aircraft in greater numbers with workers who wanted them to succeed. We were building inferior aircraft in smaller numbers with workers who wanted us to lose. The outcome was inevitable. The success of the P-51 over Berlin and throughout Germany had implications far beyond the European theater, far beyond even World War II itself. It demonstrated that air power could be projected globally. That distance was no longer a barrier to American reach, that any location on Earth could potentially come under American attack if the strategic situation demanded it. This lesson was not lost on Japan, which watched its defensive perimeter shrink as American long-range fighters enabled bombing campaigns against the home islands. It was not lost on Stalin and the Soviet Union, which began developing long-range escort fighters and strategic bombers, understanding that future conflicts would require power projection over vast distances. The Wojenno-Wozdушne Sily, the Soviet Air Force, received 10 P-51 Mustangs through Lend-Lease and tested them extensively at research facilities, though they were never used in combat by Soviet forces. Soviet engineers studied every aspect of the design, measured every component, analyzed the production techniques, seeking to understand how the Americans had achieved such a successful combination of range, performance, and manufacturability. The Mustang continued serving long after World War II ended, adapting to new roles and new conflicts. In Korea, redesignated F-51 after the US Air Force became independent from the Army in 1948, Mustangs flew close air support missions, ground attack sorties, and even some air-to-air combat against North Korean fighters. The Israeli Air Force used Mustangs extensively in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and continued operating them through the 1956 Suez Crisis. Various air forces around the world flew Mustangs into the 1980s, a testament to the fundamental soundness of the design. The Dominican Air Force retired their last F-51D in 1984, 40 years after P-51s first flew over Berlin, one of the longest service careers of any fighter aircraft in history. But the Mustang's greatest legacy was doctrinal rather than operational. It proved that air superiority was not just about controlling airspace over the battlefield, but about controlling airspace over entire nations, over their industrial centers, their transportation networks, their cities. Every modern air force builds its strategy around this lesson, first demonstrated conclusively when American fighters appeared over Berlin on March 6, 1944. The ability to project power, to strike any target regardless of distance, to deny the enemy any sanctuary, these became the foundational principles of air power doctrine for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. Behind the statistics and strategic analyses, behind the tactical discussions and doctrinal implications, were human beings experiencing extraordinary circumstances. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin meant different things to different people, but for all who witnessed it, whether from a cockpit or from the ground, it was a moment of profound realization about how the war was going, about who would win, about what the future would hold. For American pilots, it was vindication of their training, their industrial system, their national strategy. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts that day, providing initial escort before the Mustangs took over, wrote home to his family in Oklahoma with barely suppressed excitement. "We flew over Hitler's capital today. Think about that for a minute. We took off from England, flew across the English Channel, across occupied Europe, across all of Germany, circled over Berlin like we owned the place, because we did own it, and flew home. 2 years ago, the Nazis were bombing London, and it looked like they might invade England. Today we own the sky over Berlin itself. It's hard to describe the feeling, pride, power, and the absolute certainty that we're going to win this war. Not might win, not probably win, but absolutely, definitely going to win." For German pilots, men who had believed in their superiority, in their mission, in their ultimate victory, it was despair mixed with the first whispers of doubt about everything they had been told. Feldwebel Rudolf Müller of Jagdgeschwader 302 wrote to his wife in a letter that was intercepted by German censors and flagged as defeatist, but which survived in the archives. "I saw them today, Liebchen. American fighters over Berlin, single-engine fighters that shouldn't be able to reach this far. It's impossible according to everything we've been taught, but I saw them with my own eyes circling over our capital. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere in Germany. There is no safe place left. How do I tell you that I don't expect to survive this war? How do I explain that everything we believed, everything we were told about German superiority and inevitable victory was wrong? I'm sorry, I'm so sorry for what this means for you and the children. For German civilians, particularly those in Berlin who had endured years of propaganda about German invincibility and Allied weakness, it was the beginning of the end of illusion, the first crack in the wall of lies that would eventually bring the entire edifice of Nazi ideology crashing down. Ursula von Kardorf, a Berlin journalist whose diary would be published after the war, wrote on March 6, 1944, "We were told the Americans were weak, that their Jewish-controlled mongrel society could never match pure German strength and organization. Today I watched American fighters circle overhead, high silver shapes leaving contrails, while our vaunted Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. No German fighters rose to challenge them. No flak reached them. They flew over the capital of the Reich with complete impunity. Everything we have been told is lies. If they lied about American weakness, if they lied about our invincibility, what else have they lied about? What else is false? For Allied bomber crews, the men who faced flak and fighters on every mission, who watched friends die in burning aircraft, who completed their required missions and went home or died trying, it was salvation made tangible." Staff Sergeant James McMahon, ball turret gunner on a B-17 nicknamed Lucky Lady, recalled decades later in an interview for a war documentary. "Seeing those Mustangs form up on us as we approached Berlin, seeing them take position above and behind us, I'm not ashamed to say I cried. Real tears running down my face inside my oxygen mask. For the first time since I started flying missions out of England, I thought I might actually survive this war. Before the Mustangs, we were on our own deep in Germany, just us and the flak and the German fighters. After the Mustangs, we had protection. Those little friends with the big range saved thousands of us. I finished my tour, came home, married my sweetheart, had kids and grandkids. I got to live my life because Mustang pilots escorted us to Berlin and back. As the war lurched toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, as Soviet forces ground toward Berlin from the east and American and British forces crossed the Rhine from the west, the full magnitude of what the Mustang had achieved became clear to anyone willing to look honestly at the numbers. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the war as arguably the world's most powerful and experienced air force, which had swept Polish resistance from the skies in days, which had achieved air superiority over France in weeks, which had terrorized London during the Blitz, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The statistics paint a picture of complete annihilation. Total Luftwaffe aircraft lost from 1944 to 1945, approximately 45,000 aircraft destroyed in combat, accidents, or on the ground. Luftwaffe pilots killed from 1944 to 1945, approximately 15,000 pilots killed, missing, or captured. Percentage of Luftwaffe pilots operational in January 1944 who survived the war uninjured, less than 5%. These were not just numbers on a spreadsheet. These were men, many of them barely out of their teens, who died in burning aircraft or spent their final moments falling through the sky after bailing out over hostile territory. German cities destroyed by bombing. 61 major cities suffered over 50% destruction. German civilian casualties from bombing. Estimates range from 350,000 to 500,000 killed. German industrial production lost to bombing. 35 to 40% of productive capacity eliminated. These numbers represent not just military defeat, but societal collapse, the physical destruction of a nation's ability to wage war and support its population. Hermann Göring, on trial at Nuremberg facing charges of crimes against humanity and conspiracy to wage aggressive war, was asked by prosecutors when he first knew Germany had lost the war. His answer, delivered with unusual candor for a man who had spent most of his career lying to Hitler, lying to the German people, and lying to himself, became one of the most quoted statements of the entire post-war period. When I saw American fighters over Berlin, the game was finished. Everything after that was just delay, just more dead young men for no purpose. It was a remarkably honest admission from a man not known for honesty, from someone who bore significant responsibility for the Luftwaffe's collapse through his denial of reality, his transmission of impossible orders, his subordination of military necessity to political ideology. But even Göring, master of denial and delusion, architect of so much of the regime's aerial strategy, could not deny what the Mustang represented. American industrial power married to British aeronautical innovation, projected across impossible distances with ruthless efficiency, breaking every assumption German planning had been built upon. The P-51's development from initial concept to Berlin Escort fighter represents one of the most rapid and successful aircraft development programs in history, a case study in how to take a design from drawing board to operational deployment quickly while maintaining quality and incorporating lessons learned. The North American Aviation NA-73X prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, just 102 days after the British Purchasing Commission approached the company with a request for a new fighter. By March 1944, less than 4 years later, P-51s were escorting bombers to Berlin and fundamentally changing the strategic balance of the war. This speed of development, this rapid iteration from prototype through multiple production versions, was matched by continuous improvement based on systematic analysis of combat experience, something that distinguished American aircraft development from German programs that often pursued technical perfection at the expense of operational deployment. Each version of the Mustang incorporated lessons learned in actual combat. The P-51A, with its Allison engine, had limited high-altitude performance, adequate for low-level attack and reconnaissance, but insufficient for bomber escort above 20,000 feet. The P-51B and C models with the Packard Merlin V1650-3 engine transformed performance above 20,000 feet, turning a good low-altitude fighter into an exceptional high-altitude escort. The P-51D with its bubble canopy eliminated blind spots, while 6 guns instead of 4 increased firepower, and the improved V1650-7 engine provided even better performance. The P-51H, lightened and refined, achieved peak performance but arrived too late to see combat in Europe, though it would serve in other theaters and conflicts. This feedback loop, where combat experience drove rapid design improvement, which drove better combat performance, which generated more detailed combat experience, was something the German system, with its chaotic leadership, competing power centers, ideological interference, and disrupted production, simply could not match. While German engineers produced technically excellent designs like the TA-152H high-altitude fighter or the Me-262 jet, they couldn't refine these designs based on extensive combat experience, couldn't produce them in meaningful numbers, couldn't support them with adequate logistics and maintenance infrastructure. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin in March 1944 validated the entire American strategic bombing concept, the doctrine that had been developed and debated throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Pre-war theorists like Billy Mitchell in America and Giulio Douhet in Italy had argued that strategic bombing could win wars by destroying enemy industry and shattering civilian morale, making ground combat unnecessary or at least secondary. But until long-range fighter escort became available, until the Mustang made it possible, this remained mostly theory, tested imperfectly in the Spanish Civil War and early World War II campaigns. The Mustang made precision daylight bombing operationally feasible at sustainable loss rates. While the British Royal Air Force continued area bombing at night, dropping thousands of tons of bombs somewhat randomly across German cities, the Americans could now put bombs precisely on specific facilities: ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, aircraft assembly buildings at Regensburg. The accuracy difference was dramatic and strategically significant. British night area bombing achieved an average circular error of 3 miles, meaning half the bombs fell more than 3 miles from the aiming point. American daylight precision bombing with fighter escort achieved circular error of 1,000 feet, meaning half the bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the aiming point. This 30-fold improvement in accuracy meant American bombers could destroy specific industrial bottlenecks rather than simply inflicting general damage across urban areas. General Curtis LeMay, who would later lead Strategic Air Command during the Cold War and become one of the architects of nuclear deterrence strategy, stated in his memoirs, "The P-51 made strategic bombing work as doctrine predicted. Without long-range fighter escort, we would have had to accept either unsustainable losses like Schweinfurt or join the British in night area bombing, where accuracy was impossible and damage less concentrated. With Mustang Escort, we could methodically destroy specific target sets, industrial bottlenecks that would cascade through the German economy. We didn't just bomb Germany indiscriminately. We performed industrial surgery, systematically removing their ability to make war by eliminating critical production nodes. The results of this surgical approach spoke for themselves in dramatic reductions of German military-industrial output. German ball-bearing production, critical for everything from aircraft engines to tank transmissions, reduced 70% after sustained attacks on Schweinfurt and related facilities. Aviation fuel production reduced 95% after systematic attacks on synthetic fuel plants. Synthetic rubber production reduced 85%, crippling German vehicle mobility. Railroad traffic reduced 75%, preventing efficient distribution of whatever goods were still being produced. Canal traffic in Western Germany eliminated entirely, shutting down a critical transportation artery. This precise application of overwhelming force, made possible by Mustang escorts allowing sustained, accurate bombing, shortened the war by months or possibly years, according to post-war analyses. Every factory destroyed, every rail line cut, every fuel depot burned meant German forces couldn't fight effectively, couldn't maneuver, couldn't be reinforced or resupplied. The image of Mustangs over Berlin became one of the iconic visuals of World War II, ranking alongside the flag raising on Iwo Jima or Soviet soldiers planting their banner on the Reichstag. It represented American power projection, technological superiority, industrial dominance, and the certainty of Allied victory in a single compelling image. For Americans during the war and in the decades after, the Mustang became a symbol of their nation's industrial and technological prowess, proof that democratic capitalism could outproduce and out-innovate totalitarian systems. It was featured prominently in war bond posters, Hollywood films like 12 O'Clock High, and post-war victory celebrations. The fact that it was designed and built in record time by a company that had never produced a fighter before embodied what Americans like to believe about their national character: practical, innovative, capable of rising to any challenge. For Germans, both during the war and after, the Mustang represented humiliation and defeat, visible proof that the regime had lied about German superiority and Allied weakness. Post-war German literature and films often feature the image of American fighters over German cities as a symbol of the Nazi regime's failure to protect its people from the consequences of the aggressive war it had started. The trauma of being unable to defend one's own airspace, of watching enemy fighters circle overhead with impunity, left lasting psychological scars on Luftwaffe veterans who survived. Heinz Knoke, writing in 1953 as Germany was beginning to rebuild and grapple with its recent past, reflected with the painful honesty of a man who had lost everything. For a fighter pilot, the ultimate duty is to protect your homeland skies, to keep enemy aircraft away from your cities and your people. We failed utterly in this duty. The Mustangs over Berlin were proof of our failure, visible to every German who looked up, undeniable evidence that everything we had been told about invincibility was false. That shame never fully goes away. Even now, decades later, I sometimes dream of those silver shapes circling overhead while we were helpless to stop them. Military academies worldwide still study the Mustang's impact on the European air war as a case study in how technology, properly integrated into strategy and supported by adequate logistics and training, can create strategic revolution. The lessons drawn from this historical case remain relevant to modern military planning. Range equals strategic options. The ability to project power at distance provides flexibility that shorter range systems cannot match. The Mustang gave Allied commanders options the Germans couldn't counter, allowing them to strike any target in Germany with fighter protection. Integration beats isolation. The Mustang succeeded not in isolation, but as part of an integrated system combining bombers, fighters, intelligence gathering, logistics support, and systematic training. The Germans had excellent individual components but couldn't integrate them effectively into a coherent system that could adapt to battlefield realities. Production volume wins wars. Building vast numbers of good aircraft beats building small numbers of excellent aircraft when both sides are roughly equal in technology and tactics. The Mustang was excellent, but more importantly, there were thousands of them available when needed. Pilot quality matters more than equipment quality. Technology without properly trained operators is useless. American pilot training programs, with their emphasis on extensive flight hours, realistic combat training, and systematic debriefing, produced pilots who could exploit the Mustang's capabilities fully. German pilots by 1944 and 1945, however brave or talented individually, simply didn't have the training time to compete effectively. Institutional adaptation is survival. The Americans continuously improved tactics, technology, and training based on systematic analysis of combat experience. The Germans, hidebound by rigid doctrine, ideological interference, and political purges of officers who reported uncomfortable truths, couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive. Modern air forces apply these lessons daily in their planning, procurement, and training. The emphasis on long-range strike capability, integrated air defense systems, extensive pilot training, and industrial base preservation all stem directly from lessons learned when Mustangs first appeared over Berlin in March 1944. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, marked more than a tactical milestone or even a strategic victory in one campaign. It was the moment Nazi Germany's fundamental assumptions about the war, about their security, about their inevitable triumph, collapsed under the weight of observable reality that could not be denied away. The Reich was supposed to be a fortress protected by distance, defended by the world's best pilots, flying the world's best fighters, invulnerable to sustained air attack by enemies too far away to matter. The Mustang shattered these illusions in a single morning with a clarity that propaganda couldn't obscure. For German leadership, military and political, it was a moment of terrible clarity that most refused to accept. They had based their entire strategy on assumptions about American inability to project power effectively across the Atlantic, on beliefs about American industrial capacity being inefficient, about American technology being inferior, about American pilots being soft and unwilling to accept casualties. Every single assumption was catastrophically wrong, and the Mustangs over Berlin were irrefutable proof that couldn't be denied, couldn't be propagandized away, couldn't be ignored except through willful delusion. Adolf Galland, writing years after the war when he had nothing left to protect and no regime to serve, reflected with brutal honesty, March 6, 1944 was the day we lost the war in any meaningful sense. Not when Berlin fell to Soviet forces in April 1945, not when Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, but when American single-engine fighters appeared over our capital in force. Everything after was just the playing out of a foregone conclusion, the mechanical working out of a defeat that had already been decided. We didn't know it would take another 14 months, didn't know how many more would die, but the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe in tactical engagements. It proved that American industrial democracy, with all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, could outproduce, out-innovate, and outfight Nazi totalitarianism with its vaunted organization and discipline. This ideological dimension of the victory was almost as important as the tactical and strategic dimensions. The psychological impact rippled through German society in ways that are difficult to quantify, but were nonetheless profound and real. If the regime couldn't protect Berlin from American fighters, if it couldn't prevent enemy aircraft from circling over the capital with complete impunity, what could it do? If everything they had been told about American weakness was demonstrably false, visible every time someone looked at the sky, what else was false? What else had been lies? The Mustang became an unwitting agent of truth, its presence over German cities proving through physical reality that the Nazi worldview was built on lies, that the regime had led Germany into a war it could not win against enemies it had catastrophically underestimated. While the Mustang's success was decisive and its impact on the war's outcome clear, this victory came at a cost in American lives that should not be forgotten in the celebration of technological triumph. 2,520 P-51 Mustangs were lost in combat in the European theater. Behind each loss was a young man, average age 22, who would never come home to family, never finish college, never marry and have children, never live the life he had planned before the war interrupted everything. The 357th Fighter Group alone, the unit that first escorted to Berlin, lost over 100 pilots killed in action during the war. These were the best young men America had to offer, college students, athletes, young professionals who had volunteered to fly and fight when their country called. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Woods, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Group, was killed on March 31, 1944, less than a month after the first Berlin escort mission, when his P-51B was hit by flak near Brunswick. He was 28 years old, married with 2 young children he would never see grow up, would never teach to throw a baseball or ride a bicycle or drive a car. His loss, multiplied by thousands, represents the human cost of victory, the price paid by one generation so that future generations could live in freedom. Captain Don Gentile, one of the war's top Mustang aces with 21.83 aerial victories, survived intense combat only to die in a flying accident in January 1951 while testing a T-33 jet trainer, a reminder that military aviation remains dangerous even in peacetime. Many Mustang pilots who survived combat carried psychological wounds that never fully healed, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but which in that era was simply endured in silence. They had seen friends die, had killed enemy pilots at close range, had faced their own mortality repeatedly, and those experiences left marks that victory parades and medals couldn't erase. But their sacrifice achieved something remarkable and historically significant. They had taken the war to the enemy's homeland, forced the enemy to fight over his own territory, and won decisively. They had broken the back of what had seemed like an invincible military machine and proved that aggressive totalitarianism could be defeated by democracies willing to mobilize their full industrial and human resources. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944. From that day forward, it was a broken force capable only of sporadic, increasingly ineffective resistance that delayed but could not prevent defeat. As dawn broke on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, American Mustangs patrolled the skies over a defeated Germany that bore little resemblance to the confident Reich of 1939. There was no opposition because there was no Luftwaffe left to offer opposition. The aircraft were destroyed, hidden in forests without fuel, or grounded permanently by lack of spare parts. The pilots were dead, wounded, or prisoners. The infrastructure of airfields, fuel depots, repair facilities, and training schools was rubble. The transformation from March 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, just 14 months, represents one of the most complete military victories in history, the systematic destruction of an entire branch of a major military power. The P-51 Mustang had been the primary instrument of that victory, the tool that turned Allied air power from a costly and unsustainable operation into an irresistible force that could strike anywhere with acceptable losses. In those 14 months, Mustang pilots had flown over 213,000 sorties, an average of over 500 sorties per day every single day for 14 months. They had claimed 4,950 aerial victories in combat, though the actual number was likely higher, as many kills went unconfirmed in the chaos of combat. They had destroyed 4,131 aircraft on the ground through strafing attacks, eliminating planes that never got airborne to threaten Allied bombers, or support German ground forces. They had dropped 31,000 tons of bombs on tactical targets, supporting ground forces and destroying infrastructure. They had fired 99 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, each round representing a split-second decision in the chaos of combat. Behind these statistics was a human reality that numbers alone cannot fully capture. Young American men, average age 22, many barely old enough to vote, flying aluminum aircraft powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, had comprehensively destroyed one of history's most formidable air forces. They had done it not primarily through individual heroics, though there was certainly courage and skill involved, but through superior technology properly employed, better training systematically applied, sound tactics continuously refined, and industrial support that ensured every unit had the aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts needed to maintain operations. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, one of the war's most successful fighter commanders, who led both P-47 and P-51 units, provided perhaps the best summary of why the Mustang succeeded so completely. The Germans were magnificent opponents, brave and skilled, who fought with everything they had. But they were simply overwhelmed by the totality of what we brought to the fight. We had more planes, more fuel, more pilots, more training time, more spare parts, more of everything. The Mustang gave us the ability to apply that numerical and industrial superiority anywhere we chose. Once we could escort bombers to Berlin and beyond, once we demonstrated that no target in Germany was beyond our reach, the mathematics of victory became inevitable. It was just a matter of time and will, and we had more of both. When Major Hans Kogler saw those first Mustangs over Brandenburg on March 6, 1944, when his blood turned to ice water at the impossible sight of American single-engine fighters over the approaches to Berlin, he was witnessing more than enemy fighters appearing where they shouldn't be able to reach. He was witnessing the future of aerial warfare, the obsolescence of everything his generation of pilots had learned about the limits of air power. The P-51 Mustang had proven that technology could overcome distance, that industrial capacity properly organized could triumph over individual skill and courage, that methodical systematic approach could defeat improvised brilliance. That quantity has a quality all its own when backed by adequate training and sound doctrine. The German pilots who encountered Mustangs over Berlin with shock and disbelief were not just facing a superior aircraft, though the Mustang was certainly superior. They were facing the combined industrial, technological, organizational, and human resources of the United States, projected across an ocean and deep into the heart of their homeland. It was a demonstration of force that shattered every assumption about what was possible in warfare, about the limits of power projection, about the vulnerability of even the most heavily defended targets. Hermann Göring's admission about knowing the war was lost when he saw American fighters over Berlin has become one of history's most telling acknowledgments of defeat, quoted in countless histories and documentaries about World War II. But the full significance of that moment extends beyond one man's realization, or even one nation's defeat. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself, the moment when air power became truly strategic rather than merely tactical, when industrial capacity became more important than warrior tradition, when organized efficiency triumphed over individual heroism and improvisation. The German pilots who were shocked by Mustangs over Berlin had witnessed something whose implications would echo through subsequent decades of military history. The projection of American power across vast distances with precision and overwhelming force became the Messiah's continuation of Part 5, the template for every subsequent American military intervention. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Gulf War to Kosovo, the fundamental lesson remained: American air power could reach any target and dominate any airspace when properly resourced and employed. Every modern military intervention has built upon the foundation laid when those first Mustangs appeared in the skies over Brandenburg. In the final analysis, the P-51 Mustang did more than escort bombers or shoot down German fighters. It shattered the last illusions of a regime built on lies about racial superiority, national destiny, and the weakness of democratic societies. It proved that free societies, despite their apparent chaos and inefficiency, their messy democracy, and free market capitalism could organize resources, innovate solutions, and project power more effectively than totalitarian states with their rigid hierarchies and centralized control. It demonstrated that technology and industry, properly applied within a sound strategic framework, could overcome any defensive advantage provided by geography or fortification. The Luftwaffe pilots who looked up in shock at those silver Mustangs on March 6, 1944, were witnessing their own obsolescence, their own irrelevance to the war's ultimate outcome. Within 14 months, their entire force would be destroyed. Their nation occupied by the very enemies they had been told were too weak and too distant to threaten the Reich. Their ideology would be discredited and consigned to history's ash heap. The shock of seeing those impossible American fighters over Berlin was the beginning of a cascade of revelations that would end with Germany's complete defeat, occupation, division, and eventual transformation into something fundamentally different from what it had been. Today, 75 years after those events, preserved P-51 Mustangs still fly at air shows around the world, their distinctive Merlin engines producing a sound that veterans of that era recognize instantly, with powerful emotions. For American veterans and their families, it's the sound of victory, of a generation that rose to meet existential evil and defeated it decisively. For German veterans, now nearly all gone, it was the sound that announced the beginning of the end, the audible proof that everything they had believed about the war was wrong. For historians and military professionals, it's the sound that changed warfare forever, that demonstrated how one nation could project decisive air power anywhere on Earth given adequate resources, sound strategy, and national will. The story of Luftwaffe pilots shocked by P-51 Mustangs over Berlin is ultimately a story about the collision between assumption and reality, between propaganda and truth, between what was thought impossible and what American industry made routine. When those Mustangs appeared over Berlin, they didn't just shock the Luftwaffe pilots who saw them. They shocked an entire worldview into extinction, proved that a society built on lies and conquest could be defeated by societies built on, however imperfectly, freedom and mutual cooperation. From that wreckage of defeated Nazi Germany would eventually rise something new and better. Many of the German pilots who survived the shock of Mustangs over Berlin, who lived through the collapse of their air force and the occupation of their nation, would help build the post-war Luftwaffe of democratic Germany, allied with the very nations whose fighters had destroyed their comrades. Johannes Steinhoff, who survived those terrible burns in April 1945, who underwent years of painful reconstructive surgery, would rise to become Chief of Staff of the new German Air Force and eventually chairman of the NATO Military Committee. In 1983, he would stand beside American generals who had flown Mustangs against him 40 years earlier, united in defense of the freedom that his former enemies had brought to his defeated nation through their victory. This transformation from mortal enemies to steadfast allies flying together in defense of shared democratic values was perhaps the most profound shock of all, more surprising in its way than the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin. The American fighters that had appeared over Berlin carrying destruction had ultimately brought something beyond victory. They had brought the possibility of liberation from a criminal regime, the chance to build something better from the ruins. The German pilots who had been shocked by Mustangs in 1944 would in time come to understand that those American fighters had freed them from leaders who had led their nation to catastrophe. The last word belongs to Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's General der Jagdflieger, the man who had denied, then witnessed, then survived the Mustang onslaught, who had been dismissed by Göring for telling uncomfortable truths, who had led the last desperate jet fighter unit in the war's final weeks. In 1984, 40 years after that shocking morning over Brandenburg, at a reunion of American and German fighter pilots in San Antonio, Texas, where former enemies met as friends and allies, Galland raised a glass in a toast that captured both the tragedy of war and the hope of reconciliation. "You shocked us when your Mustangs appeared over Berlin," he said, his voice carrying across a room filled with men who had tried to kill each other 4 decades earlier. "You shocked us with your industry, your technology, your determination, your willingness to accept casualties to achieve your objectives. But the greatest shock came after the war. when you helped us rebuild rather than destroying us completely, when you protected us from Soviet aggression, when you could have left us to our fate, when you became our friends and allies rather than permanent enemies. The Mustangs over Berlin didn't just end a war, they began a peace that has endured for 40 years and which we must work to preserve. For that transformation, we who survived are forever grateful. The circle was complete. The shock that had begun with Hans Kogler's horrified recognition of American fighters over Brandenburg, that had cascaded through denial and desperation to final collapse, had transformed through defeat, occupation, and reconstruction into partnership and friendship. The Mustangs had indeed changed the sky forever, not just the sky over Berlin on March 6, 1944, but the strategic sky under which all nations have operated ever since, the conceptual sky that defines what is possible in warfare and international relations. In that transformation lies the true legacy of the P-51 Mustang, not just as an instrument of military victory, which it certainly was, but as a catalyst for the post-war world order that followed. The shocked Luftwaffe pilots of March 1944 could never have imagined that the American fighters destroying their force would ultimately lead to their nation's redemption, rehabilitation, and integration into a community of democratic nations united against totalitarian threats. Yet that is exactly what happened, and that outcome owes much to the fact that the war was won decisively, that German military power was broken so completely that reconstruction could proceed without lingering German dreams of revenge or renewed aggression. Part 6. The Mustangs that shocked the Luftwaffe over Berlin didn't just win a military victory, they helped create the conditions for a peace that has endured for 8 decades, a peace built on the total defeat of aggressive militarism, followed by generous reconstruction and democratic transformation. In the end, that may be their greatest victory of all, more significant even than the aerial supremacy they achieved in 1944 and 1945. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, stands as one of the decisive moments of the 20th century, a hinge point where history turned decisively toward Allied victory and away from the nightmare of Nazi domination. It demonstrated that distance was no longer a barrier when a nation possessed the industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and political will to project power globally. It proved that totalitarian systems, whatever their apparent efficiency and organization, could not match democratic societies in innovation, production, or sustained mobilization. It showed that air power properly employed as part of a comprehensive strategy could be genuinely strategic rather than merely tactical, could win wars rather than just supporting ground forces. These lessons shaped the post-war world in profound ways. The United States emerged from World War II as a global superpower precisely because it had demonstrated the ability to project overwhelming force across both the Atlantic and Pacific simultaneously. The Mustang's success over Berlin contributed directly to this new American role in the world. The Soviet Union, watching American long-range fighters escort bombers to Berlin and beyond, drew its own conclusions about future warfare and began developing long-range strike capabilities. The Cold War arms race in bombers, fighters, and eventually missiles grew directly from the lessons of strategic bombing in World War II. Smaller nations understood that without American protection, they were vulnerable to any power that could achieve what the Mustang had demonstrated, the ability to strike any target, regardless of distance. This realization shaped alliance structures, defense spending, and strategic calculations for decades. The integration of Germany and Japan, former enemies, into the American-led post-war order was possible partly because they had been defeated so completely, so decisively, that no faction could credibly argue for renewed militarism. The Mustangs' contribution to that complete defeat should not be underestimated. Today, as we look back across 8 decades to that cold morning over Brandenburg, we can see the moment with clarity that the participants could not possess. Major Hans Kogler, seeing those impossible American fighters over Berlin, understood immediately that something fundamental had changed, that the war had entered a new phase where Germany's defeat was inevitable. But he could not know that this defeat would ultimately lead to a democratic, prosperous, peaceful Germany, integrated into a community of free nations. He could not know that former enemies would become allies, that German pilots would fly alongside American pilots in defense of shared values, that the totalitarian nightmare would give way to democracy. The broader implications for our understanding of World War II history and military history more generally are significant. The P-51 Mustang stands as perhaps the best example of how a single weapon system, properly integrated into strategy and adequately supported, can achieve strategic effects far beyond its tactical capabilities. It wasn't the best fighter in every individual performance category, but it was very good at everything and could operate anywhere, which made it decisively superior in the role that mattered most, enabling precision strategic bombing at sustainable losses. The story also illustrates the importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. German pilots were often individually skilled and flew technically excellent aircraft, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers backed by better training, better logistics, and better strategic direction. The Mustang program's success demonstrated that democracies, when properly mobilized and focused, could outproduce and out-innovate totalitarian rivals. Finally, the human dimension of this history deserves remembering. Behind the statistics of sorties flown and victories claimed were young men, American and German, who faced death repeatedly in service to their nations. The American pilots who flew Mustangs to Berlin and beyond were volunteers who accepted extraordinary risks to defeat an existential evil. The German pilots who faced them were often brave men trapped in an impossible situation, serving a criminal regime but fighting for what they believed was their homeland's defense. Both groups deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals who experienced the war's horror firsthand. The shock of Mustangs over Berlin reverberated through the remainder of the 20th century and continues to influence military thinking today. Every air force in the world structures its doctrine around lessons learned when American fighters first demonstrated that distance was no longer a barrier to power projection. The emphasis on long-range strike capabilities, on achieving and maintaining air superiority, on systematic pilot training, on industrial base preservation, all stem from the Mustang's success over Germany in 1944 and 1945. In our current era, when unmanned aerial vehicles and precision-guided munitions have again transformed warfare, when stealth technology and electronic warfare have added new dimensions to air combat, the fundamental lesson of the P-51 remains valid. Technological innovation, industrial capacity, sound strategy, and political will, when properly combined, can overcome any defensive advantage. The shock experienced by Luftwaffe pilots on March 6, 1944, was not just about seeing American fighters where they shouldn't be. It was about the sudden realization that every assumption they had built their strategy upon was wrong, that the enemy they had been told was weak and distant was actually powerful and could reach anywhere. That kind of shock, that complete inversion of strategic understanding, has been repeated many times since 1944, as nations have discovered that their defensive calculations were wrong, that distances they thought were protective were actually bridgeable, that weapons they thought would deter attack were actually insufficient. The Mustang over Berlin was perhaps the first, but certainly not the last time this pattern would play out in modern warfare. For those interested in this period of military history, in World War II, stories that shaped our modern world, the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represents a moment when individual courage, technological innovation, industrial might, and strategic vision combined to achieve something that had seemed impossible just months before. It's a story worth remembering not just for its tactical interest, but for its strategic implications and its human dimension. The men who flew Mustangs to Berlin, who escorted bombers through flak and fighters, who survived or didn't, helped create the world we inhabit today. A world where American air power can reach anywhere, and where aggressive militarism has been, if not eliminated, at least constrained by the memory of what happened when totalitarian powers challenged democratic resolve. The legacy of that cold morning over Brandenburg endures in the skies above us, in the strategic calculations of every nation, in the structure of alliances and the balance of power. The shock of Mustangs over Berlin echoes still, a reminder that assumptions about what is possible in warfare can be shattered, that industrial democracies possess latent power that totalitarian states cannot match, that freedom and cooperation ultimately prove stronger than tyranny and conquest. As the sun set on that March day in 1944, as the Mustang pilots returned to England and the shaken Luftwaffe pilots landed at bases across Germany, as Hermann Göring raged at his estate and Adolf Galland contemplated strategic catastrophe in Berlin, the future had already been written. Germany would fight on for another 14 months, millions more would die, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Mustangs over Berlin had announced the beginning of the end, and nothing Germany could do would change that fundamental reality. Today, when preserved P-51 Mustangs take to the air at commemorative events, when their Merlin engines roar to life and they climb into the sky trailing that distinctive sound, they carry with them the memory of that moment when everything changed, when shocked German pilots looked up and saw the future of warfare, when one nation demonstrated it could project power anywhere on Earth. That sound, that sight, that memory serves as both warning and inspiration, warning that assumptions about security can prove false when technology and will combine, inspiration that free societies can mobilize extraordinary resources to defeat existential threats when necessary. The story of Luftwaffe pilots shocked by P-51 Mustangs over Berlin is ultimately a story about how wars are won and lost, how technology shapes history, how industrial capacity matters as much as individual courage, and how the consequences of strategic decisions made in conference rooms and design studios can cascade through history, shaping the world for generations. It's a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth studying, because the lessons it teaches about power, strategy, innovation, and human resilience remain relevant in our own complicated era. The Mustangs over Berlin changed the sky forever. They also changed the world, and we live in that changed world still, shaped by decisions made and battles fought 8 decades ago when young men flew aluminum fighters powered by Packard Merlins into the sky over Germany and proved that distance was no longer protection, that fortresses could be breached, that evil could be defeated, and that free societies, when challenged, could mobilize resources and will sufficient to defend civilization itself. That is the legacy of the P-51 Mustang. That is the meaning of the shock experienced by German pilots over Berlin. And that is why this story, this chapter of World War II history, this untold story of how a single aircraft type transformed strategic bombing and helped win the Second World War, deserves to be remembered and honored.